right back.
That initial 23 envelope of Vaughan and Nigel, I still hold up as the best work he did, or they did. I just think there was a time and a place, and it was all so beautiful and so delicate. And it comes down to that combination of Ivo and Nigel and Vaughan all wanting the same thing.
The prolific graphic designer, Vaughan Oliver, was a northern soul with a heart filled with passion and a head filled with obscure ideas. He was a man with a desire to reshape the creative landscape in his unique, singular vision, convince everyone that his way was the highway. Adrian Shaughnessy, who wrote and published an archive of Vaughan Oliver's work, believes Oliver's stature as a pioneering force in the world of graphic design was about much more than hero worshipping.
I think he stands as an example of how you can be a designer with your own vision, your own approach, your own philosophy, and you can make it work. The traditional view of a graphic designer is that we're all actors. Whatever our client wants, we do. But Vaughan did what he did, and for me, that's always inspirational.
In part 2 of this 2-part episode of Destroy, we learn more about how a young lad inspired by the record sleeves he discovered at his local Woolies headed south to London to find fame and fortune at the independent record label 4AD. A young lad who would go on to make a name for himself in the years that followed, creating work so visceral and emotionally driven, his impact would be felt for years to come. For Bella Union founder and former Cocteau Twins bass player Simon Raymond, his influence is unquestionable.
I think his influence is massive, not just on those record sleeves. You know, his artwork and his style of his artwork was copied by so many people, and is still being copied. You know, the calligraphy, the typography, the positioning of things. His influence, man, is going to go on forever and ever and ever.
But as the dark clouds of the 80s recession were starting to close in, the circles around his home at 4AD with 23 envelope were starting to shift, musically and technologically. And as the rest of the design profession followed the digital path forward, Vaughan felt he was being painted into a corner. Tim O'Donnell, who worked at V23 in the early 1990s during this time, empathized with Oliver's dilemma.
I think one of the things that Vaughan really struggled with the computer was this oversimplification of it, and it became a little bit more tedious. All the time that I was there, he really resented it.
And as the decade rattled on, these seismic shifts poured out into the mainstream culture. In the UK, post-punk fractured into new, more romantic, softer-edged offshoots, as well as drug-fueled nightclubs filled with acid house and dance music. Sounds had become more predictable and more manufactured. In America, post-punk had synthesized into grunge, given rise to the alternative rock scene, and in 1987, thrust into this turbulent storm came a band from Boston. They were different, their devil-may-care attitude oozing with bravado and bombastic overtures. They were the Pixies. Before AD, their music was loud, absurd, surreal, but also deeply human. For Vaughan Oliver, it was a rousing collision, an impassioned invitation to rewire his process and move his imagination forward again. For Cocteau Twins bass player Simon Raymond, V23's work for the Pixies stood out as being both groundbreaking and revolutionary.
The Pixie sleeves have to be some of the most iconic record sleeves in the world.
My name is Richard Smith, and I'm your host. Welcome to Destroy.
They are punk rockers.
Raw, outrageous and crude.
The new craze, they tell me.
More into chaos than anything else.
People really don't understand what kids want.
Worthless, nasty.
They're a hero.
You have to destroy in order to create.
So Ivo's over there, Deborah is there, Vaughan, me, and Ivo would say, have a listen to this. And it was Pixies as an example. Come on, Pilgrim. He said, what do you think of this?
For Vaughan Oliver, repetition was never an option. His creativity thrived on the collision of ideas, images, and sounds. At times, his approach often brought disparate elements together in a visual narrative. For Tomato founder Graham Wood, Vaughan's work was almost cinematic.
Vaughan's ethos was very textural. It had a musicality to it. It had this poetry to it. And it's a disc-shifting filmic thing to it. It's like the difference between taking a single still and making a feature film. To me, it's like he was making feature films.
The Pixies' surreal madness mirrored Vaughan's multi-layered, multi-framed, dark emotional ambitions and allowed him to open up a part of his mind no one had ever seen before. As the designer Paul West explains, the outcome was often both perplexing and moving at the same time.
Some of Vaughan's references were very dark, like really dark. He heard a voice and he was weaving his visuals to that voice of the music, which I just found astounding at times.
The Pixies' lyrics were like waking dreams, vivid, absurd, impossibly human. For Vaughan, they were a revelation, a chance to dive deeper into the strange, the uncanny, and the beautifully ambiguous. They offered a perfect match for his new way of thinking. There were so many images in Pixies songs, he said at the time, it was like a dream. I never had to take anything literally. It was also the start of something new, a long collaboration with the photographer Simon Labellestiere, whose textured, eerie photographs meshed perfectly with the band's strange, poetic, and Vaughan's even darker instinct. Chris Bigg, Vaughan Oliver's right hand for over 20 years, remembers the serendipitous moment a young photography student walked in the door at 4 AD with a book filled with profound and arresting imagery.
Simon Labellestiere came in with his portfolio, and it was the hairy man. He'd already done that shot previously for his MA degree show. And Vaughan just went, that's it. That is the Pixies cover, whether you like it or not.
Labellestiere went on to conjure a series of images that built parallel narratives alongside the Pixies' music, colliding and colluding with the listener's interpretation. Gone were the gentle blurs and the spectral whispers. Now came images that seared themselves into your memory. A hairy man, a flamenco dancer, frozen, gritty dressing rooms, bathed in shadow, a monkey with a halo. Images that lingered like incense, full of interpretation, tension, and surreal logic. For Simon Labellestiere, it was an approach based on the same instincts Oliver had been celebrating for years. We weren't looking to explain anything, Labellestiere once said. It was about finding an atmosphere, a suggestion, something just slightly off-center. It was also an opportunity for Oliver's work to become bolder, more enigmatic, even more obscure. He leaned further into discomfort. He leaned even further into confusion. He played with scale and dramatic brute force. Inspiring his creative right hand, Chris Bigg, to create calligraphic typography that twisted and danced around to subliminal, contorted beats. The emerging visual textures felt bruised, embattled, beloved. For Paul West, seeing their work in progress was divine.
My God, going into the 4AD offices when Doolittle was in production, just seeing Chris's calligraphy absolutely everywhere. The old layout pads of Chris gouge away, Monkey Gone to Heaven, just this incredible calligraphy. And that's the kind of joy which never leaves you.
It was an enormous step forward that exploded in serendipitous, unexpected ways. In 1988, his cover for Ultra Vivid Scene's first album was more of the same. For Chris Bigg, Paul West, and Tim O'Donnell, it was a massive leap forward.
He got a package from a friend in New York with this gaffer tape on it, and that became the cover of the Ultra Vivid Scene album.
Well, you know, there's all these coded messages, that beautiful silver gaffer tape over the toothbrush.
It was sort of like embossed, so it felt like actual tape.
The toothbrush is a lightly weird angle.
That to me, it's just so much about how he would make these very interesting pieces out of those very disparate elements.
That to me was a big leap. Elevating the everyday or seeing something in nothing.
It was just such a beautiful album cover.
The late 80s continued to be a transformational period for Oliver, who found himself facing seismic challenges from all corners of his life. Nigel Grierson, his closest creative companion and his best friend from school, departed to pursue fine art. Undeterred, Vaughan reimagined 23 Envelope in the guise of a more fluid collective. He simply called it V23, a fitting name for someone also fond of acronyms. It was a fresh start that brought new creative connections, Mark Atkins, Jim Friedman, and Martin Anderson to name just a few, but each of whom pushed him further into uncharted territories, something Vaughan leaned into, as Paul West and Adrian Shaughnessy witnessed firsthand.
Everybody talks about Vaughan's style, but of course, so many people help contribute and bring their own unique take, whether it's layout, choice of typeface, etc.
In the book, one of the problems we had was to make sure we credited everybody. And he was great about that. He never hid the fact that maybe a whole run of sleeves were principally the work of someone like Mark Atkins. He never hid from that fact. That was his process, to see who he could pull in to his web, into the jaws of the Vaughan Oliver machine. And somehow what came out was Vaughan Oliver.
And as the 80s rolled into the 90s, it brought a new wave of admirers from even further afar. Tim O'Donnell, who moved to London in 91 because his girlfriend said, "What else do you have to lose?"
That was like such a defining period for me. Every job since has been pretty boring because, as you can imagine, it's just sort of like, well, nowhere else brings trays of gin and tonics at 9:30 in the morning. I don't understand.
But landing his dream job and being part of the legendary V23 was a nerve-wracking experience, often filled with immense trepidation, especially for the young American from New York.
I did feel like the pressure of just like, why are all these 4AD sleeves shit all of a sudden, right? They've got this American kid. So I was very anxious to not be the person who ended this long span of amazing work.
Even still, despite the multiple steps forward, the 80s also came with more heartbreak. The Cocteau Twins, Vaughan's longtime muses, departed 23 Envelope and then, eventually 4AD. Vaughan was gutted. Cocteau Twins bass player Simon Raymond explains how tensions on every level forced them into making dramatic changes.
There's no doubt that Vaughan was a massive fan of the band. That's incontestable. Whether the band ultimately agreed with his vision for our music or not, you can't argue with his passion. He always wanted us to love it. Because there'd been a little bit of a fallout and we didn't end up working with him. I know he was really sad not to continue working with us.
Bravely and without remorse, he handed the torch to someone he could trust, Paul West.
We were in the Alma, and I was talking to Vaughan and Chris, and we were just around the table, and I can remember I was drinking a pint of Guinness, and I just said to Vaughan, "So when is the next Cocteau's album coming out?" And Vaughan said, "When you design it." It was just such a surreal moment, but he never commented on the design. And to be honest, I never wanted him to either.
Chris Bigg, who had only assisted at 23 Envelope, also stepped into a larger role at V23, taking the lead on projects with artists such as the Wolfgang Press and Pale Saints. One of Bigg's first solo sleeves was for the album Ignite the Seven Cannons by indie darlings Felt. Stepping into Vaughan's enormous shoes was the beginning of a new dawn for each of them. They had been through a lot together, and Chris Bigg was determined to let nothing hold them back.
I worked hard and he could trust me, and I made things happen, and I could do things that he couldn't. I think that's where we bonded. Because you give people an opportunity and they can make a mess of it, can't they, and flunk it, or get bored of it, or change direction. But I was in for the long haul, for good or for bad.
V23 certainly gave Oliver a taste of independence, but it came with its struggles too. He joked with Adrian Shaughnessy about the difficulties he was facing. 4AD was no longer at his side, and for the first time in a long time, Vaughan had to fend for himself.
Vaughan had this most wonderful thing in 4AD with Ivor Watts Russell, the perfect partnership. I remember once he called me up and he said, "How'd you get work?" I said, "Well, what do you mean, Vaughan?" He said, "Well, I don't have the 4AD thing anymore. How'd you get work?"
Chris Bigg, who was at the centre of it all, also recalled how difficult it was.
When we set up on our own and moved out of 4AD, it all became a little bit too serious. Suddenly it was our responsibility to get work and find work.
Yet, regardless of the struggles, Oliver's reputation was starting to gain worldwide recognition. Exhibitions became a vital part of how his legacy was framed and gave him a newfound confidence. Designer Jonathan Barbrook remembers how Oliver struggled initially, but eventually found his own.
I remember that he hated speaking publicly and he was embarrassed about talking about his work. But you could see underneath also, he felt like he was worth the consideration. That's not being arrogant. That's just realizing you've worked hard and you've actually done something good. And then there was this magical change in where he seemed to suddenly enjoy it and actually maybe realized that he was worthy of the attention, just feeling more comfortable with himself. And that was a great transformation to see. And with that, he sort of relaxed.
In France, a landmark 4AD retrospective that landed at Paris's Parc La Villette due to overwhelming demand was hailed as a grand recognition of graphic design starting to acquire the status of art. For Vaughan, it was an opportunity to frame his work as both precious and profound.
I mean, often asked about, well, is it art? I tried to deal with that at the opening of the exhibition. So you see the street posters to sort of illustrate or exaggerate the two perceptions of it, the street, and then you see the blank wall, the bright white wall with the baroque frames and the corny little bright images, just exaggerating the preciousness of it.
All things considered, it seemed by the second half of the decade, the public attention he was getting was starting to pay off. Corporations like Sony and the BBC began to flock to his door. At Huff magazine, his grand artistic vision mesmerized collaborators and laid a path to the empathetic network heads of European broadcasters at Canal Plus, as well as the oak-paneled tech temples of America and Microsoft. And although his ideas sometimes fell on deaf ears, he reveled in it. Tim O'Donnell, who was at V23 during this time, recalls how Vaughan still approached even the most corporate client with the same irreverence he always would.
I remember from that was he went to Los Angeles with Paul McMenamin to do a Microsoft ad. There was a line in the script that was like, "Are you ready?" And so Vaughan had an E made out of red perspex or whatever, and everyone on set was like, "What's happening?" But his brain worked that way with like wordplay and stuff.
And even though the decade had started with some uncertainty, V23 ultimately saw Oliver push through the pain and embark on creating a body of work more tactile and even more experimental, more personal and even more sensitive. A reflection of his true self that for some was often hard to break through.
He puts up this kind of aggressive wall, and if you penetrate it, then you're in. If you don't, fuck off. That's it. It's over.
For Chris Bigg, Vaughan's personality was often a dichotomy.
Really shy, but really outgoing, incredibly generous, intriguing person to navigate. You know, having a friendship and working together and working that out and not taking advantage. You know, I think I did a few times over the years. I think he did at times. We worked together for 20 years. It was a long time. And you really get to know someone really quite well, you know.
For those he let in, working with Vaughan was intimate, intuitive, transformative. He treated you with the same love and care he bestowed on his family and close friends. He respected you, loved your music, and was committed to helping you succeed. Lush vocalist and guitarist Mickey Berenyi remembers this vividly.
He would have real observations about the music, and he clearly would listen to it properly. He had thoughts about it, and that was what he would use for creating the sleeves. And I think not only is that incredibly flattering, but it's very respectful. He made you feel very involved with it.
In many ways, Oliver's commitment was rare. His ability to understand an artist's vulnerability was intuitive. It was also a sensibility that helped shape his ideas for Lush's 1990 mini-album Scar.
What Vaughan had come up with these very beautiful pink and mauve colours on the album sleeve, but with these scratches down it. And he explained it all and said, there's a really pretty, delicate side to your music, but it's got that kind of scratchiness and sort of edginess to it. And so that was literally where we got the album title. Having someone like Vaughan actually listen to your music and not patronise you and totally take it seriously, that was really important to me.
This sense of emotional commitment came because he was vulnerable too, someone who understood what it felt like to wear your heart on your sleeve. This is what set Vaughan apart. He didn't treat design as a surface. It was a translation, a kind of spiritual echo of the sonic glory trapped inside. With the final years of the 90s unfolding, Vaughan Oliver stood at a creative crossroads. The decade had brought acclaim, the publication of Visceral Pleasures, This Rimy River, his first solo show in the US, but also further rupture with the sale of 4AD, fracturing a key partnership. Rather than retreat, he pushed outward, embracing new realms, the Breeders, David Sylvian, fine art, theatre, and fashion. He became a mentor, his workshops and lectures inspiring a new generation of admirers. Far from fading, this was reinvention, fuel for 2 rich decades ahead, marked by exhibitions in Tokyo, Athens, and Barcelona, a Grammy Award, teaching posts, the publication of his archive, and what would be a final resonant return to the Pixies. Hey there, sorry for the interruption, but if you're enjoying the show, please support us on Patreon or follow us on Instagram at Destroy Punk Podcast. Now back to the show.
He was wonderful with students. Most of the studio personnel that went through 23 Envelope or V23, most of them came straight from college. He was so good like that.
He was so sweet and so generous and really bright and interesting, and introduced me to things that I'd never heard of, and
The designer Vaughan Oliver loved nothing more than sitting down with a group of students and having a good chinwag about Werner Herzog and who should have won the FA Cup final. Embracing his natural ability to connect and inspire, in 2014, Vaughan Oliver returned spiritually to his roots, taking on a full-time role at the University for the Creative Arts in Epsom, Surrey. Surrounded by rolling hills of green pastures and Mesolithic thatched cottages, it was here he became what Terry Dowling had once been to him, a catalyst. Not a lecturer who dictated technique, but someone who could unlock something deeper. For V23 collaborator Tim O'Donnell, it spoke to Oliver's commitment to fostering talent who never felt judged.
Honestly, it's sort of informed how I try to work with people now, in terms of just letting them get on with it and stopping by and giving a little nudge here and there. The creative director who asks you to get out of the chair and does it themselves, I've just never understood it,
Oliver's teaching style was also slightly unorthodox. Like Dowling, Vaughan also wasn't interested in the traditional grid-based design philosophy. He also didn't care for symmetry, classicism, or formality. His students often found themselves elbow-deep in ephemera, fragments of detritus. He encouraged risk, the tactile nature of printed matter, errors, and he was always, as always, willing to stop and listen. For Graham Wood, Vaughan's approach was both informed and instinctual.
He was one of those people who absolutely knew what the correct way to do things was, down to this degree, but because he knew the sort of processes and approaches and techniques, that's why he can fuck it up. That's why he was able to then look for the places where things would be misregistered or would be run on sheets and how you deal with that.
He also didn't teach typography in the traditional sense. For him, it was a means by which to articulate an elaborate visual haiku. He once joked, "I can't believe I'm in charge of a typography course. I don't even use a computer." It wasn't false modesty, it was the truth. For Tom Murray, who worked with V23 on the cover for Tulipomania's first album, This Gilded Age, his experience showed a side of Oliver few would ever know.
We just let him do whatever he wanted. He would just send us sketches, and there was never any point where we were asking for any changes. He certainly wasn't full of himself in any way. And that was really just an interesting thing to meet somebody who was at the top of their game and so easy to work with.
For Tulipomania and V23, it was also an induction into a fruitful collaboration that would bring them together again a few years later for the Pixies' anniversary show at London's Roundhouse in 2018.
Charles and he had conversations about how we don't use computers really as replacements for cameras. We don't really use them to generate the imagery. We talked a lot about making music videos with him. Charles and I agreed to make multi-projection stage backdrops with him for those shows.
For Tom and his partner Cheryl Gillover, it was a creative deep dive into the unexpected, It was also tragically the last time they spoke.
When the show was happening at the Roundhouse, we went over and met him, and they had a video before the show that had been made about Vaughan, and he was joking the night we were there with him that he was the opening act, because it was like everybody's standing there waiting for the Pixies, and there's like 15-minute video about Vaughan, and we were standing next to him, and he was laughing like through the whole thing, and then he was going to introduce us to everybody, but he got ill, and he wasn't well enough to stay past the end of the show.
When I heard the news, I was awake all night thinking of Vaughan, about when we first met in the first year at college, when I went to see him at 4AD in Alma Road. He was very kind and beautifully encouraging, as I know he was to so many others, all students of the ineffable. When I heard he'd gone, I went for a walk along the seashore, somewhere in between a change of state, solid into liquid into air, to think of Vaughan.
It was impossible to foresee, but in 2019, Oliver was to design his last Pixies cover, Beneath the Eyrie, a final collaboration with his muse-like co-conspirator, the photographer Simon La Ballestier. The album's songs explored themes of loss, darkness, and the macabre, and the cover image reflected that mood, a visual representation of the album's darker and more experimental side. I wanted to intermingle the spirit world with life and death, the mystical and more surreal landscapes, Pixies vocalist and guitarist Black Francis said. For Oliver, it was his final visual contribution for the band, embracing their lyrical imagery without literal translations, turning the songs into visual dreamscapes. There is no doubt that throughout his entire life, Vaughan Oliver always strove to create an atmosphere, a sacred kind of chaos where people could experiment, fail, and find their individual voice. He was demanding, for sure, but he also was willing to give others the opportunity to shine in his light, always free of guilt.
Vaughan was an incredible benefactor and an incredible creative force. Vaughan really cared. Vaughan reached out. Vaughan said, yes, come in. When you're 22 or whatever, you just think you're center of your own little universe. But my memories of Vaughan were just one of the most powerful influences I've ever had.
That spirit of spontaneity, imperfection, and intimacy wasn't just in his work, it was also in the way he lived. And when Vaughan Oliver passed away in December 2019, a bright light went out in the design world that had been shining for over 40 years. The heart of a soul so young and so fervent switched from being present to being far away, like a distant star far in the sky. His death rippled through the music industry, the design community, and the generations of artists who had grown up with his sleeves propped up like portals against their tatty bedsit walls.
I always just think Vaughan just was on his own satellite, and in a sense, he still is. He's still so he himself and independent. He is the spirit of independence.
According to designer and Assorted Images founder Malcolm Garrett, Vaughan Oliver was the most inspirational of record sleeve designers. The emotional power contained within his layered imagery captured the essence of the music in a uniquely transcendent way. In a special tribute, Simon Raymond outlined Oliver's legacy in clear, precise words. It goes without saying what a hugely influential artist he was, but more importantly, he was a wonderful father, a great man, very funny, with impeccable taste in music, art, and cinema. His work in the 80s and 90s changed design forever. In the years since, Vaughan's wife Lee, a designer and educator herself, has worked tirelessly to ensure his legacy lives on. In 2021, alongside Northumbria University and 4AD, she helped launch the Vaughan Oliver Graphic Design Scholarships to support emerging artists from the Northeast, right where Oliver's journey began. When asked why, Lee said, "Vaughan was a huge inspiration to so many designers and artists. We hope this scholarship helps support the next generation who follow in his footsteps." Among his peers, few had felt that kind of inspiration more deeply than the designer Jonathan Barnbrook, who was a fan of Oliver from day one.
To me, he's one of the best graphic designs in the history of graphic design because of the way he so sympathetically used images and text together before the start. of the computer. He was so far ahead of everybody else. It was absolutely unbelievable.
Because Vaughan Oliver wasn't just a designer, he was a myth maker, a wise and visionary seer, a believer in possibilities, a master of subtle wit. He made records feel like special gifts, objects of desire, a dream come true, like modern-day heirlooms, like something to cherish, to touch, to puzzle over, to shoegaze and wonder, how did you know what to say so consciously? Yet, his work never answered. It only answered your interpretation, your relationship with the music, an answer that simply helped suggest its meaning. For Barnbrook, Oliver was a torchbearer for the DIY attitude formulated by 70s punk.
I think Vaughan was a natural successor to Jamie Reid. You knew there was a particular form, a particular way of expressing the message. And I think Vaughan was the successor to Jamie in that individual style which motivated a generation along with the music.
But it wasn't just in the work, it was also in his philosophy. A belief that chaos, the cut-up, ambiguity, the intuition, and the emotional spontaneity were not just valid, but essential. For Barnbrook and many others, Vaughan Oliver made space for a different kind of designer, one who could be poetic, subversive, and sincere, all at the same time.
Vaughan is a good example of someone who hasn't really cared about the principles of you've got to go and get a job, you have to train for industry. He created his own job and he created his own world, and people were excited about it. And I hope he's a good example to students, and that if you follow your passion, you follow your instinct, it can happen for you.
Yet Oliver left behind no manifesto, no how-to guide, no guiding principles or rules, just a body of work and a formidable way of working, a refusal to settle for anything less than a slipping glimpse of wonder, a commitment to the beautiful mistake, and in doing so, he built something truly timeless. A visual legacy that still whispers, wordlessly, hauntingly, movingly, long after he's gone.
What he taught me was this insatiable desire to surprise himself, really, push the boundaries and not be lazy, and push yourself and experiment.
In the words of his friend and fellow nonconformist, British designer Neville Brody, Vaughan Oliver was one of our most influential, inspiring and individual designers. More of an artist than a designer, he invented and opened new worlds and narratives for each of us to enter, where tactile details met degraded physicality, raw, decaying surfaces encountered delicate, natural objects in a kind of fetishistic and ritualistic mesh, everything bound together by an obsessively exquisite and detailed typographic poetry, iconic and forever evolving. Few weeks, we will be launching a brand new season called Voices of Protest. It's going to be a little different, but we have a really great lineup of really interesting guests. Follow us on Instagram at Destroy Punk Podcast for more details. Now back to the show. So much of Vaughan Oliver's work was about abstract threads of ideas that inferred a hidden narrative. A strand of hair, a trace of texture, a shadow across a face. He only ever gave us glimpses rather than answers, symbols rather than signs. And maybe that's what grief is too. Not something to resolve, but something to sit with. A half-remembered dream, a healing wound, a vision that stays with you. Even now, long after his passing, you can still feel it. That atmosphere, the music, the moon and the melody, and the rhythm in his art. He showed us that graphic design doesn't have to explain, it can haunt, chillingly too. Depict stories wrapped in vast, elaborate fantasies, fond affections sunburst and snowblind, mortal coils of treasure, songs to the sirens, lush, ultra-vivid scenes, morning glory, the heart of the sunrise, where is my mind? Yes, it'll end in tears. Forever, his name is alive. If you've ever stood in a record shop holding a Cocteau Twins LP or a Pixie CD and wondered exactly what you were looking at, you were already halfway there. That was the magic of Vaughan Oliver, a northern soul, a visual poet, a generous teacher, and a reluctant artist who made music visible. For all of us, and everyone who reveled in his light.
Chris Pigg, graphic designer.
Tom Murray, Cheryl Gulliver and I are Tulipomania. We write and record music and make film and animation together.
Jonathan Barnbrook, graphic designer.
Mickey Brenny, Lush, Mickey Brenny Trio.
Paul West, graphic designer and landscape artist.
Daydream Shaughnessy, graphic designer. I teach design. I write about graphic design. And I'm also a publisher.
Tim O'Donnell, graphic designer.
Graham Wood, designer.
Simon Raymond, Bella Union.
This episode of Destroy was written and produced by Be Right Back Studios with the generous support of Lee Widows. A special thanks to everyone who shared their time, their memories, and their love for Vaughan. Music for this episode was composed by Tokyo Iconic. To see some of the artwork mentioned in this show, as well as music videos and archival interviews, please visit destroypunkpodcast.com. You can also support our show via Patreon or follow us on Instagram at Destroy Punk Podcast, or simply share this episode with someone who still believes in the tactile and the oblique.
Here I end this read. Box 3, spoon 5.
This has been another episode of Destroy. Thank you for listening, and thank you, Vaughan, for everything. My name is Richard Smith, and I'm your host. I'm a filmmaker and art director, and once upon a time I was part of the big 80s. I designed record covers for Depeche Mode, I danced with Bono, discussed art with Mick Jagger, and drank tea with Susie Sue. I also grew up during those turbulent times in England in the late 70s and was driven by the do-it-yourself ethos of punk. I obsessed over bands like Joy Division and New Order, and went on to work for the album cover designer Peter Saville. I believe that year, that moment in 1976, when a bunch of foul-mouthed yobs cursed and swore on national television, changed the future of culture forever, and is what brought us to where we are today. So where do we go from here? Will emerging new technologies be the catalyst that tears down the walls of mediocrity, throwing culture and society into chaos and revolution again? We'll have to wait and see. This has been another episode of Destroy. Thank you for listening. Destroy is a Be Right Back Studios production. Learn more at BeRightBackStudios.com. And please tune in again for another episode of Destroy, the Influence of Punk podcast, wherever you listen or download. Be right back. The archival audio used in this episode of Destroy is taken from a variety of unknown sources. Every effort has been made to use these clips responsibly concerning their original creators for the purpose of education, commentary, and tribute. All rights remain with the original rights holders.